are military analytics. But for now, the Russians have concentrated all their forces to surround the Bakhmut city. They are attacking it from the north and south, trying to cut off supplies to the Ukrainian troops. Enemy tanks are trying to break into the city. But the Ukrainian artillery is not sleeping. An Excalibur projectile accurately destroyed a moving Russian tank. Later, another tank is destroyed while trying to enter the city. Ukrainian artillery men ruthlessly destroy enemy vehicles. Anything marked with the letter Z must be destroyed and burned by any means necessary. The Russians can barely break into Bakhmut with armored vehicles. Therefore, they rely on the infantry entry and constantly send them into assaults against them. The Ukrainians mainly use 60 and 80 caliber mortars. This is the most effective weapon against the advancing infantry fire. Adjustment is conducted from a hidden observation post. Each successful hit brings joy to the Ukrainian commanders. Mortars almost never stop in Bakhmut on the eastern side. The fighting is already taking place directly on the streets of the city. The enemy is trying to occupy the buildings and turn them into strongholds. Once peaceful houses become a battlefield, Ukrainians have to fight for every street, for every house. The most difficult thing is to knock the enemy out of the buildings. To do this, you have to use a large caliber machine gun. And in the most difficult situations, only tanks can help. The Russians are not afraid to use fighter jets, knowing that the Ukrainians can easily shoot down their planes. In these footage, you can see a downed Russian Su-25 on fire. The pilot ejected and parachuted down to ground. Ukrainians also actively use aviation, Mi-8 helicopters. But the main striking force is still artillery. The Russian troops tried to destroy the most valuable Ukrainian M777 howitzers by attacking them with Lancet kamikaze drones, and they often succeed. Sometimes the Lancet hits projectiles near the howitzer. In this video, we see how a Ukrainian soldier is trying to save shells from detonation. Dangerous, but necessary work. The M777 howitzer can still be repaired, but the shells cannot exploding. They can do more damage than a Russian drone. In order to protect the howitzers, the Ukrainians cover them with such nets. The Russians also use the Lancet drones to destroy other important Ukrainian weapons such as the Stormer H-Air defense system. But Ukrainians also have kamikaze drones. On this video footage, you can see how they are used on enemy armored vehicles. Tank destroy too. And on this video, Ukrainian drones track down and destroy two Russian air defense systems. Ukrainians destroy enemy armored vehicles with artillery strikes. The Excalibur is unique. High-precision guided projectile allows them to destroy tanks with pinpoint accuracy. It is controlled by aerodynamic rotors and uses GPS. In fact, it turns Ukrainian howitzers into large-caliber sniper rifles capable of hitting single targets tens of kilometers away. The Russians can only dream of such accuracy. They don't have high-precision artillery at all. Because of this, they spend more ammo than they need. But most of all, Russians love to use MLRS systems. This is the most indiscriminate weapon ever made. The Bakhmut city and its surroundings look like a landscape after the First World War just because of this type of weapon. Hundreds and thousands of exploding shells destroy houses and trees, mixing everything with the ground. This is how the Russians hope to win by leaving behind scorched earth. And this is the Tu-S7 self-propelled howitzer, the most powerful Russian gun. Its 203mm shell is capable of reaching up to 20 miles and causing enormous damage to the enemy. Fortunately, the Russians do not have many of these shells and then use them. Not often. Ukrainians actively use the M270 launcher near Bakhmut. It's like doubled HIMARS. Ukrainians hide it in the forest as it is a very valuable weapon. It has an important role to play to destroy enemy ammunition depots, command posts, and enemy MLRS systems. Every day Ukrainians destroy some large Russian depot, as you can see on the footage. On the outskirts of the Bakhmut, Ukrainian troops defend their positions in trenches. This is a personal video from a Ukrainian soldier. It is the first battle in his life. These guys are taking the brunt of the enemy artillery before advancing. The Russians poured tons of artillery shells on them, and then they advanced with the support of mortar fire. Ukrainian soldiers must first survive under artillery strikes and then repel attacks on their positions. The enemy is trying to cut off the roads that supply the city. They are trying to surround the city and force the Ukrainian troops to leave. Bakhmut is already in a semi-encircled, but as long as there is a road to it, the city can be held. Let me tell you about the road to Bakhmut. Ukrainians call it the road of life. Every day and night, Ukrainian troops are supplied along it. And on the way back, they transport the wounded. You can see a lot of destroyed Ukrainian equipment along the road of life. This is because the enemy often shells the road. Many vehicles never make it to the city with food supplies, and many of the wounded never made it out. It's one of the saddest places in Ukraine. Sometimes even the weather complicates life on the front line. Due to the rains, the ground becomes muddy and turns into a swamp. This brings additional moral discomfort to the soldiers. It is especially difficult when water appears in the trenches. Heavy armored vehicles cannot pass through the dirt roads. These roads become an additional challenge for the soldiers. Mud complicates logistics and takes away precious time. As you know, armored vehicles like firm ground. Only then can the army advance quickly and successfully. The Ukrainian command consults every few days on the need to hold Bakhmut. The effectiveness ratio is currently in favor of Ukraine. This means that the enemy is suffering much more losses here than Ukraine. Bakhmut buys time while the main forces of the Ukrainian army prepare for a major counteroffensive. In these video footage, you can see the presumed use of the American high-precision bomb Javelin and the Bakhmut city. Several videos have leaked online confirming this. And if it is true, the Russians should definitely worry. The JDAM bomb is dropped from an aircraft. It can fly up to 40 miles, hitting the target precisely and causing significant damage to enemy structures. See, for example, how the Americans bombed JDAM in Afghanistan. A small village was wiped off the face of the earth. When the Ukrainian army goes on the counter-offensive, the Russians' fortified positions will also be swept away by this massive fire. Putin needs some kind of victory. Russians hope to capture the city of Bakhmut with great persistence and sacrifices to demonstrate to the world at least some combat capability of the Russian army. But even if the Russians capture the city, it will not bring them any benefit. The fate of this war will soon be decided by the Ukrainian counteroffensive, which we all look forward to. The Ukrainian army continues its strategic operations. Today's developments in the war zone led to a heavy defeat for Russia. The Ukrainian army is advancing step by step to victory. Let's look at the background of these operations together. The Ukrainian army needs to be very clever to win this war because the Russian army is much more numerous than the Ukrainian army. Ukrainian soldiers know this, so they make very strategic decisions in all operations. Today, a new one was added to these operations. The Russian army continues to suffer heavy losses. The course of the war has now completely changed. All signs point to Russia's defeat. The Ministry of Defense of Ukraine made a statement today providing information about the losses of the Russian army. According to this report, the number of Russian military casualties in this war is about 130,000. The exact number of wounded soldiers cannot be determined. Thousands more Russian soldiers who were hospitalized are thought to have died. In order to hide its defeat in this war, Putin's government does not make any statements about the number of wounded and dead soldiers. But this is causing anger among Russian soldiers. Ukrainian President Zelensky made a statement on this issue. Zelensky said that Putin does not care about that Russian soldiers. They don't even count their dead because they don't care about them. We are determining how many Russian soldiers have died. Zelensky's statements attracted the attention of Russian soldiers. Zelensky has been attracting the attention of Russian soldiers with his statements since the beginning of the war. Thousands of Russian soldiers left the army influenced by Zelensky's statements. Zelensky, a former comedian, knows how to influence people. His statements are changing the course of the war. Zelensky doesn't just make statements. He also gives orders to commanders for strategically important operations. Today's extraordinary operation was allegedly planned by Zelensky. By using drones, Zelensky can secretly monitor all movements of Russian army soldiers. The Russian army's air defense systems cannot detect the drones used by Ukraine. That's why the Ukrainian army has information about all the plans of Russian soldiers. Today, the Ukrainian army started to monitor Russian soldiers in the Russian-occupied Novoaida region. These soldiers were making preparations in ammunition depots. Russian commanders who examined this preparation realized that a new ammunition transfer would be made to the region. Russian soldiers were organizing two warehouses to make room for the new weapons and missiles. The Ukrainian army soon determined the route along which this ammunition would arrive. Railroad plans in Luhansk Oblast were examined and Russia's secret plan was exposed. HIMARS, the most powerful missile system of the Ukrainian army, recorded the coordinates of the transit points on the railroad. The operation started as soon as the Russian army transported ammunition by trains. HIMARS missiles destroyed trains carrying Russian ammunition. The Russian convoy went up in flames. It is known that this train contained a large number of rifles and bullets. There were also thousands of grenades, gas grenades, rockets, and other ammunition used in positions. After the destruction of this train, all the attack plans of the Russian army were disrupted. The Russian army wanted to advance in Ukraine by conducting operations from this region because this region is very close to Crimea. The Ukrainian army is getting closer to Crimea every day. Russia wants to stop this advance of the Ukrainian army in order not to lose its control in Crimea, because Crimea has very important symbolic values for Putin. Putin's administration invaded Crimea in 2014. This invasion was presented as Putin's greatest achievement since those years. Putin still brags about occupying Crimea. If the Ukrainian army succeeds in liberating Crimea, it will be a major blow to Putin's reputation. Putin is doing everything in his power not to lose Crimea, but the Ukrainian army is doing everything it can to liberate Crimea. Ukrainian President Zelensky also thinks that the liberation of Crimea is very important. Zelensky said this war started in Crimea and will end in Crimea. Zelensky also mentioned Crimea in another interview. The reporter asked Zelensky what he would like to do first when this war is over. Zelensky said, "I want to swim in the sea with the people on the Crimean coast." Zelensky's statement proves how eager he is to liberate Crimea. The Ukrainian army has proven itself to the whole world with its successes on the battlefield. Ukrainian soldiers are considered to be among the most successful fighters in the world. Many combat videos from the battlefield show Ukrainian soldiers gaining the upper hand against Russian soldiers who are much more numerous than them. The Ukrainian army is making history on the battlefield. The Russian army is shaming the whole world. Russian soldiers made the whole world see the truth in this war. Putin was constantly threatening the whole world and implying that the Russian army was capable of taking over the whole world because of Putin's aggressive policies and threats. Everyone thought that Russia had a very powerful military arm. Putin had technical information about his army and kept saying that Russian soldiers were very well trained. But when the war started, the truth came out. It turns out that most Russian soldiers are very bad at even holding a gun. Russian soldiers drop their weapons on the front line. They don't know how to throw bombs and never win a battle. Russian soldiers experience great fear, and their combat training is very poor. Also, the tanks and other weapons used by the Russian army are not as good as they think. Russian tanks proved to be very flimsy in the war. The Ukrainian army has managed to destroy 3,201 Russian tanks since the beginning of the war. Russia's artillery and air defense systems are also useless against Ukrainian weapons. The Ukrainian army is using the most advanced weapons sent by NATO. These weapons are inflicting a heavy defeat on the Russian army. The Ukrainian army is very lucky with ammunition following negotiations by the Ukrainian president. NATO members are sending the most advanced weapons to Ukraine. Finally, work has begun to send Leopard 2 tanks and Patriot missile systems produced in Germany to Ukraine. After the delivery of these vehicles to Ukraine, the Ukrainian army will become much stronger, especially thanks to the land operations to be carried out with Leopard 2 tanks. Many regions will be liberated from the occupation of the Russian army. The Ukrainian army is waiting for the tanks to be delivered as soon as possible. As a result of Ukraine's operations using Leopard 2 tanks, Russia may withdraw from this war completely. Because Russia's military capacity is no longer enough to win this war. It is known that many leaders in the Kremlin are pressuring Putin to withdraw from the war. Due to the intensification of Ukrainian operations in the Zaporizhia region, Russian forces concentrated their attention on this area and even started provoking engagements to entice Ukrainians to attack. However, in the meantime, Ukrainians discreetly crossed the Dnipro River and established a 20-kilometer wide bridgehead on the eastern bank, opening the way for their sabotage and reconnaissance groups to facilitate the collapse of the front line by hitting Russians in the back. Last time I told you that Ukrainians improved their tactical position along the whole Orikhiv front, in particular in front of Kamensk and east and west of Nazarenko. I also told you that the whole polar front started being more active because of the increase in number of artillery and aviation strikes and ongoing extensive demining of the fields. The freshest report suggests that the Russians decided not to wait until Ukrainians launched their offensive and launched a series of attacks first. As a result, Russian forces managed to increase their bridgehead in front of Doroshenko and Mariupol. Closer positions also allowed Russians to start targeting Ukrainian positions in the unnamed settlement in front of Mariupol. The main goal of this actions is to not give Ukrainians enough time to prepare and force Ukrainians to engage the accumulated forces prematurely. And Russian sources are reporting significant concentrations of troops, namely up to 10,000 assault men only around Huliaipol. Russians used exactly the same tactic during the Kherson counteroffensive, when Russians could observe significant concentrations of Ukrainian troops but did not know where Ukrainians were planning to launch their main attack. They tried to imitate an offensive to precipitate the unfolding of events, although it didn't help. Speaking of the Kherson region, Ukrainians have increased their bridgehead on the eastern bank of the Dnipro River to the point where many Russian sources started raising the alarm. Previously, Russian forces continued to occupy and establish observation posts in the residential areas of the islands in the Dnipro River Delta. The first clashes for control over the islands started when Russians attacked the bridge to Karantina Island. This did not help as Ukrainians gradually pushed Russians from the Veliki Pokomkin Island. Shortly, Ukrainians also established control over the approximate island with a lot of places for docking. However, the biggest news by far became the fact that Ukrainians are present in the residential area of one of the biggest and most important islands in the region, the so-called Antonivsky Island. Such substantial control over the eastern bank of the river gives a lot of freedom for the Ukrainian sabotage and reconnaissance groups. This 20-kilometer wide bridgehead is already hard to control. So if Ukrainians establish control over the remaining residential areas and get closer to the mainland, then a lot of Ukrainian sabotage teams will slip through and assist in the main phase of the counteroffensive operation by destroying strategic objects and critical railways and bridges. Several days ago, Ukrainians also made the third test of their ballistic missile system, RIM-2. The target became an unspecified object in Kerch. The rocket was shot down, but everyone understood that this was just a test and the real attack would be concealed behind a massive drone and missile strike. The most important takeaway is that Ukrainians established at least 3 positions for launching ballistic missiles: Odessa, Kherson, and Zaporizhia. The targets of these strikes were also objects in the vicinity of critical ground lines of communication, such as the Crimean Bridge and crucial railway stations in other cases. And Ukrainians continue launching drones on Crimea as well. Today, 2 drones hit the Russian Black Sea Fleet in Sevastopol. Military analysts are saying that the main goal of this seemingly ineffective drone attacks in small groups is to keep the finger on the pulse and understand the current disposition and capabilities of the Russian air defense. Ideally, Ukrainian commanders should see a decrease in the air defense density because Ukrainians took significant steps to force Russians to stretch their air defense. For example, today, Ukrainians successfully destroyed a Russian oil depot in the Luhansk region with a drone attack. Russian sources also reported that today at least 3 Ukrainian drones reached Moscow. Interestingly, they were not shot down. They just ran out of gas. Russian military panicked and temporarily closed the sky over the military bases around Moscow. Russians have already started relocating their air defense from the front to protect the sky over Moscow, and such drone attacks are aimed at making sure that they continue doing it at the expense of Zaporizhia and Crimea. Russian analysts are warning that once Ukrainians are ready to launch the main phase of the counteroffensive, they will send swarms of drones to overwhelm Russian air defense in the region. And once the air defense is down, they will conduct extensive hammer, strike, and use ballistic missiles. RIM-2 to take out Russian supplies right when they are going to need them the most.